Really pleased to have Gail Robb as our first speaker for adult education this fall. Gail and her family were members of this congregation from 1980 to 1993 when she graduated from the United Theological Seminary and was ordained, and you were ordained in this church. And since then, your entire career has been spent as in interim ministry, and it's so wonderful, just so wonderful to have you here with us to be able to serve in that capacity. So welcome, and I'll let you tell the rest of the story.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I often do this after I've been in a church a month or so, but it's maybe worthwhile to start with it so that people who have questions about interim ministry can ask them now, and then if you think about it down the road, you can come and see me. But I always think that if you hire somebody for a specific job, you probably need to know how that person is going to define that job and do that job. And since you've hired me to be your interim minister, I think this is a good place to start. Interim ministry is not so much of a new concept anymore. I know this church, at least in my memory, has had two interim ministers. But there are some here who may not have had an experience of working with an intentional interim minister. So first of all, thank you for being here. I hope that I cover what you want to know and still have time for some questions and comments. I just want to begin by helping to think about why a congregation would hire an interim in the first place and then how that happened. And maybe it's easiest to start with the how, since it might help you understand how I got here. In the Presbyterian Church USA and the United Church of Christ, it takes an average length of time, 12 to 18 months to call a pastor. It used to take a little longer. It's shortened a little bit because we now do everything electronically. That's the average length of time. Sometimes it can be longer, and sometimes, really, it can be shorter. I worked with a congregation that elected the call committee in the spring, and they had a candidate the second week in September. So it depends on how dedicated your committee is. But in either case, it still feels like a long time for a congregation if they have to limp along with pulpit supply and the goodwill of neighboring churches for things like funerals and weddings. It's also a long time to expect other clergy staff to pick up the tasks that have been left by the departing pastor. So churches are encouraged to hire an interim pastor, somebody who will do more than simply hold the place open until the new installed pastor comes along. Those of us who do interim ministry, most of us, have gone through specialized training. I did mine through the denomination and also through the Interim Ministry Network. We understand that the tasks of interim ministry are quite different from just day-to-day functioning of the church, but we also understand that we're expected to do all of the day-to-day stuff over and above the interim ministry work. In both of our denominations, there is a clear procedure for hiring an interim. The church works with both local denominational offices to prepare a job description, and those are pretty standard. Then a committee is named by the session and given the task of interviewing candidates. And when they have identified the person they want to hire, they bring that name to the session, who approves the terms of the contract, and an offer is extended. Interim contracts are written for a year, and they're renewable on a year-to-year basis. So, for example, if this church has a call ready to be extended in 18 months, you will still have renewed my contract for another year. And that's because it has a release clause, a 30-day release clause, which means that either side of the contract can terminate the contract if you have 30 days notice. So that means that the call committee, once they have a starting date, will give me at least 30 days notice. And that's long enough to wrap things up and clean out my office. And since I probably will not be looking for another job, it makes it a whole lot easier. When a church dissolves a pastoral relationship, it's usually for a fairly mundane reason. Either the pastor has retired or has taken another call. That's not always, but most of the time. Occasionally, either the pastor or the congregation comes to the conclusion that things are not working, and oftentimes that's when a departure and a severance are negotiated. What most churches don't realize is that while the reasons for leaving might have been unremarkable, the leaving itself is not. So we're going to think a little bit about the why of that. So try to imagine this particular scenario. Pastor Smith has been at the First United Church for 32 years, and he decides to retire. The congregation, having loved and been loved by this person for most of their life together, is heartbroken. And because their denomination doesn't strongly encourage hiring an interim pastor, they immediately move to a call committee and get going on the process. In the meantime, they hire occasional pulpit supply, and they rely on their associate pastor to carry the full load of pastoral care, preaching, teaching, education, and youth ministry, and anything else that comes along. When the new pastor comes on board, 6 months later, she's welcomed with open arms and sighs of relief and much celebration. And 2 years later, when she announces her resignation, nobody can figure out why. Well, she spent 2 years listening to how much they miss Pastor Smith, who, by the way, never quite left. He and his wife still worship regularly with the congregation. He's often asked to preside at weddings and funerals, and there's always a heated discussion about the appropriateness of that. And of course, the new pastor can never quite measure up to Pastor Smith in any way, shape, or form, no matter how hard she tries. The associate pastor, who's still hanging on by his fingernails, also resigns, with no possibility of another call. He's been totally burned out by the whole experience. The rest of the church staff, the secretary, the preschool director, the organist, the choir director, the custodian, are also exhausted by the events of the last 2 years, by the bickering and the gossiping and the undercurrent of threats to leave or withhold pledges, so they're all actively looking around for other positions. Something's wrong with this picture, and hopefully, thankfully, it's not an accurate picture of McAllister Plymouth. So we'll try this again. Pastor Smith, bless his heart, retires, and the congregation sends him off with tears, a goodbye luncheon in his honor, and a nice check. The judicatory committee that oversees pastoral transitions has had him in for the conversation about separation ethics and has suggested that he and his wife affiliate with another congregation once they get back from the Alaskan cruise that was a gift from the congregation. The congregation and staff have about a month-long breather, during which time they clear out the office, they do some much-needed redecorating and cleaning, they enjoy the services of pulpit supply preacher, and they welcome the new interim pastor they've just hired. When the interim pastor comes on board, he hits the ground running. At the Adult Education Forum, he invites concerns and questions and then outlines his goals and expectations for the interim time. As the year goes on, he manages to move the congregation and the staff through their grief over the loss of beloved Pastor Smith. And when Pastor Smith makes his first appearance, the interim pastor takes him out to lunch and gently, maybe not so gently, reinforces the denomination's separation ethics policy and politely lets him know that he won't be coming back to do funerals and weddings, and that it would be best for him and his wife to find another bridge group. The associate pastor, having been there for 10 years, decides that it's time for him to move on, and he is encouraged by the interim pastor to explore other options. The rest of the staff is still undecided. Then the interim pastor begins to hear rumblings of unrest, apparently driven by rumors that the church secretary is passing on to church members about what the interim is trying to accomplish. When they talk about it, the interim pastor and the secretary, and believe me, interim pastors are not known for standing back when it comes to those conversations. He learns that it's her inability or her unwillingness to make the transition that's fueling her unhappiness, and she decides to leave. Within 6 months, there's a pastoral search committee in place working on the church profile. 14 months into the interim time, they announce that they have a candidate. The pastor wraps up the interim tasks as best he can, preaches a couple of sermons about good transitions, enjoys the luncheon the congregation has planned for his last Sunday, and packs up his office. Now let me say it's never that simple or clean. Let me also say that in the 6 interim positions I've had, all of the above has happened at one time or another, and fortunately not all at the same place. It's not simple or clean because around the edges of the interim tasks, which are ongoing, the interim pastor is also planning worship and preaching and doing pastoral care, maybe teaching some part of the adult education class or confirmation, working on the budget, putting out fires left, right, and center. The congregation may be dealing with other more difficult issues which require additional energy and work on the part of the staff and the congregation and the leadership, but it's never dull and it's often rewarding. If you can walk with the congregation through an interim period and come out alive at the other end, it's been a good day. And most interim pastors I know would tell you that there are very few bad days. All the ones I know are still standing and ready and willing to take on the next assignment. I want to turn now to what are called the interim tasks of the congregation and then talk a little bit about how I see all of that happening here at McAllister Plymouth. My plan is to just talk about one of those, and then I'm going to do a little more in the here and now every chance I have to just sort of talk more about interim task of the congregation. And I'm sorry, I had a handout, and it's downstairs in my office, but I'll make it available to us at another time. The first one is coming to terms with history, and that means figuring out who you are. It takes time to put the tenure of the last pastor and sometimes all of the former pastors in perspective and figure out who you are apart from that pastor. It's being able to talk openly about the past, about the good parts and the not so good parts, the joys and the disappointments, maybe the hurt and the embarrassment, and the ongoing celebration of being together. It's looking at who you were and who you are now, and what parts of that are important and worthwhile to carry into the future and which parts are not. It's allowing some time and space for grief, which can sometimes come out as anger and confusion, acting out, hostage-holding behaviors, any number of things. Next is facilitating shifts in power and leadership. Most churches have areas of their life together where leadership is entrenched and sometimes stagnating. Most churches also have groups, social or otherwise, who have been together a long time. And there's nothing inherently wrong with either of those things, as long as the groups are willing and able to incorporate new members. And that, quite frankly, rarely happens. So some of that needs to change. And it needs to change so that if the direction of the church needs to change, new leadership can make that happen. That doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need to find ways to honor past leaders and keep them involved. You might be surprised. Some of them may be relieved to be given permission to put something down that they've been carrying for 30 years. Or they may want to do something completely different and didn't know how to get out of the previous commitment. The third interim task is seeking a new identity. And that usually begins with a self-study, which we will do here. There are a number of ways to do that, and on Thursday the session talked about appointing a subcommittee at my request to begin working on that, and we're going to get going on it. It means we take this interim time as an opportunity for growth and renewal, and we ask questions like, who are we apart from the former pastor's personality and style of leadership? And is the staffing model one that works and will continue to work, or does it need some attention? Next is rethinking denominational linkages. We want to develop a healthy relationship with both denominations, if for no other reason than that's who's going to be working with us as we call a new pastor. Beyond that, we understand ourselves to be a connectional church. We are connected to other churches in both denominations and the wider church through our participation, our mission giving, and our reliance on their support and help. The other thing about rethinking denominational linkages is developing a better understanding throughout the congregation about who we are as both a Presbyterian church and a member of the United Church of Christ. There's always some resistance to that in every congregation, but as long as we're going to claim the connection, we need to understand why we do things the way we do and where we fit in the broad realm of Reformed theology. And finally, there is a commitment to new leadership in the future. By the time we come to the end of this interim period, it's my job to make sure you're ready to welcome a new pastor, and then it's my job to leave. We want some excitement and consensus about the future, a shared vision of what we believe God is calling us to be and do, and what God is wanting us to do in this next phase of our life together. So we're going to do a little visioning into the future, but that particular task usually comes when you have called your pastor. So we'll take a little breath here, see if there are any questions before we move on to specifics of interim time here at McAllister Plymouth. How are we doing so far? Questions? I just keep talking, but